So I'm recording ahead of time because I'm planning to be away on Motzei Shabbat. So this is the daf for Shabbat or Motzei Shabbat, and it is Masechet Zevachim daf Samach Bet 62. We're talking here, uh, if you get up to this, hopefully, about the structure of the Mizbeach and how it was built. And because I don't exactly know where he got up to, and because of the short daf, I'm going to start on daf Samach Aleph Amud Bet, 5 lines from the bottom. This may be review, very likely will be, but we're going to start from 5 lines from the bottom on Samach Aleph Amud Bet for today's daf. Says the Gemara, Ki ata Ravin. When Ravin came, remember Ravin came down from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said in the name of Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi Mishum Bar Kapara. He said in the name of Shimon ben Pazi, Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, in the name of Bar Kapara. That when we say that they added on to the Mizbeach, what it means is Shitin Hosifo. They added on a place where the string, the Shitin literally means like the cavities, like the pipes that go underground. Remember, on the Mizbeach, they would pour yayin, right? So they would pour nisachim. And what it used to be in the Beit HaMikdash of Shlomo is that they actually had like a empty spot, a hole in the Mizbeach. Rashi says that the corner of Maravit Dromit, so the southwest, so if you walk up the ramp to the left, there was a little spot there where there basically was a channel that was on the outside of the Mizbeach where they would pour the water down and go into the ground, and these holes in the ground went all the way down into, deep into the ground. In the second Beit HaMikdash, they decided that they wanted to cover up those holes. And so basically they added to the Mizbeach in that corner, and they made holes in the Mizbeach, basically pipes through the Mizbeach going down into them, so that instead of pouring the water over the wine over the side of the Mizbeach, they made the Mizbeach there and you poured it onto the Mizbeach through the holes. Why did they do that? Meikar Savar, because initially they held in the Beit HaMikdash Harishon that Mizbach Adama. Torah says that the Mizbeach is full of earth, basically, meaning it should be solid. There shouldn't be any holes inside the Mizbeach. Shu Atum Ba'adama. It should be filled with earth, meaning you can't pour something into a hole. You can't have a drain in the Mizbeach. Well, the Besof Savar, but eventually in the second Beit HaMikdash, they concluded that Shtiyat Ka'achila, that the drinking of the Mizbeach, is like eating of the Mizbeach, meaning just like you basically put food on top of the Mizbeach to eat it, you put drink on top of the Mizbeach for it to drink. What does it mean, Mizbach Adama, which sounds like it should be solid? It just means Shum Mechubar Adama. It just means that the Mizbeach should be attached to the ground, meaning Shlo Yivnu, that you shouldn't build the Mizbeach Lo Gabi Kipim, not on top of arches. I mean, you can't put a Mizbeach. Remember, obviously in Yerushalayim, as you guys know, if you look at Robinson's Arch, right? There's a lot of things that are built where the ground under them is not solid. You can't build the Mizbeach under kipim, under arches. V'lo gabi mechilot. Now turn to the top of daf samach bet amud aleph. You can't build it on top of mechilot. Mechilot are tunnels. So meaning that the Mizbeach has to be built on solid ground. That's what it means. Not that it has to be solid. And there actually could be holes inside the Mizbeach to pour the liquid down for nisachim. Amar Rav Yosef. Now says Rav Yosef, when he started thinking about when they expanded the Mizbeach, Lav Hainu Titania, isn't this, Rashi goes through here, if you recall, that Rav Yosef forgot a lot of his learning, and then when he heard things, he used to try to recall what he knew. So he said, Lav Hainu Titania, isn't this what I learned in this Breita? It says in the Breita the following. It says in the pasuk in Ezra, when they came back to rebuild the second Beit HaMikdash, V'yachinu et HaMizbeach al mechonato. They prepared the Mizbeach on its mechonoto. Mechonoto literally means on its pedestal, on its base, right? They built it on its structure. What does that mean? Shehigia, it sounds like it means that they built it properly. Shehigia l'sof midotav, that they figure out the perfect size for the Mizbeach, implying that in the first Beit HaMikdash, they hadn't figured it out. So Ezra came, or the people of Zerubbabel who came back and built the second Beit HaMikdash, they built the Mizbeach on the right place, implying that it wasn't the right place before. But it said that when Shlomo built the Beit HaMikdash, it says in Divrei Yamim, Hakol Bichtav Miyad Hashem Alai Eskil. It was all written down from God. Exactly, they had explicit directions. So how could you say that they built the Mizbeach correctly in the second Beit HaMikdash, implying it wasn't correct in the first Beit HaMikdash, right? It should be that the first Beit HaMikdash was absolutely correct. Ella Amar Rav Yosef, says Rav Yosef, you know what it means when it says that the second Beit HaMikdash had a need to build the Beit HaMikdash bigger? Not because they said, oh, the first Beit HaMikdash was wrong and we're going to do it better. Because Kra Ashkach V'Darash, they found the pasuk in the Torah and they darshaned it the following. It says in Divrei Yamim, Yomer David said, Zehu Beit Hashem Elohim. This, David's talking about where he's going to build the Beit for Hashem. V'zeh Mizbeach La'olah Li-Yisrael. And this will be the Mizbeach for the Olah. Now, this pasuk in Divrei Yamim puts together the Bayit, which is the Ulam and the Eichal, and the Mizbeach. And so they darshaned in the second Beit HaMikdash, Ki Bayit, we want the Mizbeach to be just like the Bayit. Ma Bayit Shishim Amma, Af Mizbeach Shishim Amma. Just like the Beit HaMikdash, the house itself, the Ulam and the Eichal was 60 Amot, the Mizbeach can be 60 Amot, and so that's why they made the Mizbeach bigger, because they darshaned the pasuk that really the Mizbeach is supposed to be much bigger than what we initially remember. We talked about 32 Amot, it should be 60. It says the Gemara, I don't understand. When they went to the second Beit HaMikdash and they came back to build it, so Bishlam Bayit, I understand that they were able to build the second Beit HaMikdash on the place of the first one, because how they know where the first one was, it had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. But Mikra Tzurata, you can see the Tzura here means like the foundation, the poles and the rushes, the deep poles in the ground. You can find the Beit HaMikdash where it used to be. El Mizbeach Ben Ayati. How'd they know where the Mizbeach was? Right? How, when they came back for the second Beit HaMikdash, remember we've had a whole machloket in the last week on the Mizbeach in the south, in the north, in the middle. How did they know where to build the Mizbeach? Says Rebbe Elazar, very interesting. I got it to Amar Rebbe Elazar, Ra'u Mizbeach Banoi. They came back and they actually saw a vision of a Mizbeach built already. It wasn't. They had to fill it in. But they saw this Mizbeach. Umichael Sar HaGadol Umeinu Makriv Alav. And the angel, Michael, the Sar HaGadol, was standing on the Mizbeach. So basically, they saw a vision of a Malach Mizbeach, we'll call it, which was not, it's probably transparent, but they knew how to build the human Mizbeach based on the vision that they saw. Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha Amar, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha says, you know how they knew in the second Beit HaMikdash where to place the Mizbeach? We are 10 lines from the top on Daf Samach Bet Amud Aleph. The way they knew where to build the Mizbeach was Efrosh Yitzchak Ra'u Shemunach Boto Makom. The tradition, of course, is that the Akedat Yitzchak happened on Har HaBayit, on the place where they put the Mizbeach, and somehow, how you knew they were ashes of Yitzchak and not the ashes of the billion korbanot that were brought there, you can tell they saw the ashes of Yitzchak were there, and that was the place where you built the Mizbeach. Reb Shmuel Bar Nachmani Omer, Reb Shmuel Nachmani says, you know how they found it? Mikol habayit kulo ericho reich ketoret. In the rest of the space, in the Har HaBayit, you smelled ketoret everywhere. But if you go to where the Mizbeach was, you smelled the barbecue. Misham ericho reich evarim. There they smelled all the millions and millions of limbs and flesh of animals that had been burned in that spot. So you can tell, it's like you go and you see where the barbecue was made, essentially. So here it's not saying they saw it on the ground, but they smelled the difference in the spot where the Mizbeach used to be located. Amar Rabbi Chana, Rabbi Yochanan, says Rabbi Chana, they didn't need to know where the Mizbeach was because they had Nevi'im. Shlosha Nevi'im alu imahem min hagolah. There were 3 Nevi'im, remember Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, who came up with them from the Golah, and they relied on these Shlosha Nevi'im to tell them where things were supposed to be. Where am I? Rashi quotes, Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi came up. Echad shehid lehem al Mizbeach. One of them, like the 3 angels who came to Avram, they each had a separate job. One Navi told them where to place the Mizbeach. One Navi told them about how to make the Mizbeach. Ala Mizbeach, meaning what size to make the Mizbeach. Echad shehid lahem al Mekom Mizbeach. One of them told them about the place of Mizbeach. The Echad shehid lahem, one testified for them and told them for the message of Hashem, shemakrivim alfa b'shein bayit, that even if you haven't yet built the Beit HaMikdash, but you have a Mizbeach, you can start bringing korbanot. So that was a chiddush, and that was what one of the Nevi'im told them. Of course, Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi told them many other things, and you can read them, at least in part, by going to Trei Asar and reading those Nevi'im. But these were additional things that they told them. Now, in a Breita, B'Matznita Tana, a Breita has a slightly different version of this, and the Breita says that we are the second to last narrow line. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Shlosha Nevi'im alu mehem min hagolah. three Nevi'im, three prophets came up with them from the Gola. One did double duty. He told them how to build the Mizbeach and where to put the Mizbeach. One who testified to them that you can bring karbanot on the Mizbeach even before you've built the Beit HaMikdash. And one of them taught them how to write the Torah, shetikativ ashurit, that you have to write it in ashurit. Remember that ashurit was a new text. It was what they did. Ashurit means Assyrian, right? So it was not the original Ktav Yehudi or whatever Ktav we called it. It was done that way, and the Navi prophesies to them that you're allowed to write it. Rashi says they originally wrote it b'chtav ivri, and now, as we've done in the Masechet Sanhedrin, and now they were able to write it in Ktav Ashurit. Back to the Mizbeach, second wide line. Tanu Rabbanan, says the Braita, Keren v'kevesh v'sod v'ribua ma'akvin. The following parts of the Mizbeach are ma'akev, meaning you need to have them in order to bring a karban. What is that? Keren. Keren means the ramp. Sorry, Keren means the pieces, whatever they're called, right? The corners that are built up on the Mizbeach. Kevesh means the ramp. Yisod, as we learned before, is that little part that's on the bottom, on the base, where they would pour some dam. That's essential. If you don't have a Yisod, you just build a Mizbeach with the ramp and the horns. It's not a Mizbeach. Viribua, and it has to be square. All of those are ma'akfin. That is essential for the Mizbeach. If you build the Mizbeach without the keren, the kronot, which is on each of the four corners, without a ramp, without a Yisod, it's not square, it's not a Mizbeach. That's makev. But how big it has to be, midat arko, how long it has to be, midat rachbo, how wide it has to be, which of course have to be the same because it's a square, midat komato, how tall it has to be, ein ma'akvin. Those are not makev. Now, Menani Mili, how do you know that that's essential? Amar Avuna, because Amar Kra, ha-mizbeach. When the Torah refers to the Mizbeach, it doesn't say Mizbeach, it says ha-mizbeach. And therefore, kol makom shnemar ha-mizbeach la'akev. Every time it says the ha-mizbeach, it's la'akev. And by basically, all Rashi quotes through the psukim, by all these things, by the corner, by the yisod, by the ribua, what's the fourth one? By the ramp, sorry, it always says karnot ha-mizbeach, yisod ha-mizbeach, and that's how you know it's ma'akev. Says Rash, says the Gemara, Elamiyat, if that's the proof, what about ki'ur l'Rebbe? Now the ki'ur is a novel concept that on the Mizbeach, there's a debate about what exactly it is, but literally ki'ur means the engraving that they put around the Mizbeach. And most understand that it means that they dug out well, there's different explanations actually, but what Rashi says that it means that they just dig tziyurim, they made decorations basically around the middle of the Mizbeach, around the outside of the Mizbeach. So it's basically like a lattice work of art around the Mizbeach. There's other interpretations. Sovev, and the Sovev, which if you recall was the ledge essentially that they made around the Mizbeach, those two parts, the kior according to Rebbe, right, who Rebbe said you have to have it, and the Sovev, according to Rebbe Yossi bar Rebbe Yehuda, they should be Hachanami Ma'akev, because they basically learned it out of a pasuk. The pasuk says, "V'natata ota, you should put it. We don't know what it is yet. Tachat karkov hamizbeach milamata, below the karkov of the mizbeach." Right, this is a pasuk back in when they describe the mizbeach in Shmot. Vitanya. Now the Braita says, "What is the karkov mizbeach? Ezu karkov." Rebbe says that's the kior. Those are the drawings around the outside of the Mizbeach. This is the ledge around the middle of the Mizbeach. But either way, the Karkov, it says Karkov ha-Mizbeach. So if ha-Mizbeach is ma'akev, then the Karkov should be ma'akev. Says we're in. You're right. In fact, it's true. You do need to have the Karkov and whatever that means, either meaning the kior according to Rebbe or the sovev according to Rebbe Yossi Rebbe Yehuda. And I'll prove it to you. Titania, we have a Braita. If you recall, this is a Braita in Masechet Sukkah, where it talks about a case where there was a Kohen Gadol who was at Stuki who didn't want to do Yain Nesach, so he put it on his toes instead of pouring it on the Mizbeach. And it says they all threw their estrogim and stones at him. And Oto Hayom, says the Braita, this is now the quote from the Braita, on that day when they had this big riot in the Beit HaMikdash, Oto Hayom, around 10 lines from the bottom. Nifkima Karen Mizbeach. The kronot, one of the ledges, one of the corners of the Mizbeach was damaged because the stone hit it or someone rushed into it and it broke a piece off of it. And says the Braita, well, it looked pretty ugly. They took a big piece of salt, meaning a solid, thing of salt, and they sealed it up. So they covered up. It's like, when the door breaks in the store in the riots, they cover it up with a piece of plastic or a piece of cardboard. So they use that. It says the Braita, lo mneshe kasher lavoda. Obviously, that doesn't make it kosher for avoda because a piece of salt or a cardboard is not going to make a mizbeach. But it was thought to be ugly, right? You don't want the door or the corner of the mizbeach to look broken, right? But says the Braita, it's not kosher. Shekol mizbeach she'ein lo keren v'kevesh v'sod v'ribua pasul. Any mizbeach that doesn't have these four things that we quoted earlier, the corners, like in this case by Sukkot when it was broken, or the ramp, or the yisod, or the ribua, or it's square, it's puzzle. And says the Braita, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Afa Sovev. So here, clearly, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda adds the Sovev. Remember, there's a machloket about what exactly that is. According to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, that's the Karkov HaMizbeach. And since it says Karkov HaMizbeach, and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda says that's the Sovev, therefore the Sovev is also Ma'akev. Taner Rabbanan now says the Braita, let's analyze this a little bit more. What is Ezu Karkov? What is the Karkov of the Mizbeach? So says the Braita, Bein Keren the Keren, between each corner to the other corner, Makom Mahal Hiluch Raglei Kohanim Amma. It was a space where the Kohanim would walk, that was an Amma. So imagine a flat surface on the Mizbeach. Each corner has a Keren that goes up one Amma, right, 18 or 20 inches. Between those two, right, and it was a long distance, it was 32 amot. So between those two, there was this area where the Kohanim would walk. It was a special ribbed area or dented area where the Kohanim could walk on that space. Says Gemara, how could the Kohanim walk on that space? If you get to the corner and there's a post there, you can't walk on the post. So what do they do when they get to the corner? Ask the Gemara, Atu Kohanim ben Karen the Karen Avi Azli? Wait, the Kohanim only walked from one corner to the next corner? What did they do when they got to the corner? Right? If the space to walk was in between the two kronot. Ela'ema, you're right. What it means is within that. It means makom hiluch raglei kohanim amma. That inside, so from the edge of the mizbeach, you would go one amma for the keren, and then one more amma for what was called the karkov, which is where the kohanim would walk on the top of the mizbeach. It says, what do you mean they walk on top of the mizbeach? Hachtiv, when the Torah says the karkov, it says tachat karkov milamata ad chetzio. Right? The Karkov is below the halfway line of the Mizbeach up to halfway. So it sounds like it's on the outside, on the bottom part of the Mizbeach. You can't walk on the top of the Mizbeach and call that the Karkov. Answers Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. Of course, there were two Karkovs, as everyone would have guessed. Trei Havi. There were, in fact, two Karkovs. We're now where am I? Trei Havi were 5 lines from the bottom. Chad Lenoi. One was done for decoration, and that was what we talked about earlier. The one on the outside of the Mizbeach was just this beautiful lattice work of maybe, I don't know what it had, if it just was a design or if it had flowers on it. That was called the Karkov Milamata Ad Chetzio. But there was a separate Karkov, and I don't really know what the etymology of the word Karkov is. There was a separate Karkov on the top of the Mizbeach. That was more, again, some say it means like there were little, like when you have the ground, like in Israel, they have this actually, where the grounds are stone and they're very they're very slippery. So you have parts where you have these little bumps on them that you can then, get traction on. So that it was basically these little bumps. And the reason they had that is because if you recall, the top of the Mizbeach was made out of stone. The Kohanim were barefoot. There was a lot of blood and guts and fat and ash, going around the top of the Mizbeach. And it was very slippery. So they made a special indentation, some say, but Rashi says that these little dots on top, chad lekohanim lo nishtarku. It was for the Kohanim so that they would not slip off the Mizbeach, because that would, of course, be very dangerous. The Mizbeach was quite high, and so it would be a very bad idea to fall off the Mizbeach. So they had basically grippers on the floor of the Mizbeach around the edge, not in the middle, but around the edge, so that the Kohanim could walk around. Now, continued the Braita before and said, these are the things that are ma'akev. But midat arko, right, umidat rachbo, the length and the width, midat komato, and the height, ein ma'akfin. Amar Rabbi Mani, that's not true 100%. Bilvad shlo yifchatenu mi mizbeach shasam Moshe. right? You can make a mizbeach smaller than what Shlomo did, which was 32, or maybe what they did when they came back to second Beit HaMikdash of 60, but you can't make it smaller than the mizbeach she'asa Moshe. How big was that? The comma. How big was the mizbeach she'asa Moshe? Now, I don't know why the Gemara asked that, because everyone who reads the Pasuk knows that it says the mizbeach that Moshe made was 5 amot by 5 amot, right? But they asked the question, and Rav Yosef said it was an amma, 1 amma. So machakule, they all laughed at him, they mocked him. What do you mean? You forgot the pasuk, Rav Yosef? It says in the pasuk, chamesh amot orech v'chamesh amot rochav ravua yiyah mizbeach. 5 wide, five across. The mizbeach is square. Amalei Abaya said Abaya to Rav Yosef, or Abaya was a student of Rav Yosef, right? Said Abaya to Rav Yosef, maybe what you mean was Dilma Mekom Maracha Kamar Mar. Maybe Mar, sir, is saying the place where they burn things. Because if you recall, the Mizbeach was 5 amot across, but on 1 amma on each side was connected what's called the Yesod, right? So basically it was 3 amot, and then 1 amma on each side was where the Kohen walked. So the actual fire, if Moshe's Mizbeach, was just 1 amma by 1 amma. And that's what he meant. Now, if you have a Mizbeach of 30 amot and you go in a couple amot, you have a much bigger internal size. But in Moshe's Mizbeach, they only had 5 amot across, and remember it's 2 sides. So if you go in 1 amma on each side, you got 3. If you go in one more amma, you only got 1. So that maybe that's what you meant, said Abaya. Amarle, Rav Yosef said to Abaya, of course that's what I meant. They're all idiots. Mar Digavarabu, you who are a smart guy, Yalda Amina, you understood me immediately. Kari Alei called about them, meaning he said about the other students in the Beit HaMidrash who thought he, or maybe they were colleagues, who thought he was an idiot. He called them B'nai Keturah, right? B'nai Keturah, which was, I guess, the real insulting description of people. B'nai Keturah is like calling someone, Rashi says, you're like B'nai Avraham, but you're not Yitzchak and Yaakov. You're the other son. So these were, these people are they have some connection to Judaism, but they're not exactly the A game. So that was his insult for those people who laughed at him. And while we're on the topic, Bnei Achdi Rabbi Tarfon, the sons of the sister, or what we call the nephews of Rabbi Tarfon, Haviyatvi Kamed Rabbi Tarfon, they were sitting in front of Rabbi Tarfon. Patach Lamar, he was, I guess, tricking them or something. And he said to them, Vayosef Avraham Vayikach Isha Shmo Yochani. Avram took another wife, and her name was Yochani. Now, they said to their uncle Rabbi Tarfon, what do you mean? You forgot the pasuk, Keturah Aktiv. It says Keturah. He says, of course I remember that. Karyala, B'nai Keturah. I just was basically calling you B'nai Keturah. So essentially, it's like you get someone to say the word about themselves. He was prompting them to say the word Keturah because he was making fun of them or demeaning them that they are, again, this is the insult that they would throw around, B'nai Keturah. Amar Rabaya Bar Huna, Amar Rav Chama Bar Guria. Says Abaya Bar Huna in the name of Rav Chama Bar Guria, it says in the Torah that you make Shnei Gizirei Eitzim. 2, I don't know how to translate Gizirei. We often translate as logs or areas of wood. Said Abaya Bar Huna, the name of Reb Chama Bar Guria, the Gizirin Shasa Moshe, the Shnei Gizirim that Moshe made, they weren't regular logs, or kan amma. They were an amma long, so they were, 18, 20 inches long, but they were also an amma wide, Rochvan amma. So they were basically, instead of being logs, they were these large planks almost, not planks, but like flat things of wood. V'ovyan kimachak godeshsa. And their thickness, their height, was like a machak. Machak is like the leveler, which is a stick, right, that you would push down, that of godesh of a sa, the overheaping container of a sa. So basically you'd have a container of a sa of grain, let's say, or salt or whatever. You'd fill it up, and then you would take the machak to smooth it out, to level it out. So that was how thick it was. So that's not very thick, but it was basically very wide and very broad. Amar Reb Yirmiyah, says Reb Yirmiyah, well, when you say that, it's ba'amma geduma. It has to be talking about an amma geduma, which means a shorten, a cut off amma. Amar, right, so, and how do you know that? Because I remember, if you recall, there wouldn't be space on the Mizbeach for these gezirim. Remember, because the whole space to burn it on the Mizbeach was only 1 amma, right? So they had to be a shortened amma. Amar Rav Yosef, says Rav Yosef, that's what we learned in the Braita. Lav Hainu Titania, isn't this what we learned in the Braita? This is not what we learned in the Braita, because the Braita says, Al Eitzim Asher Al Eish Asher Al Mizbeach, that you burn the karbanot on the Eitzim, on the Eish, on the Mizbeach, and that tells you, Shelo Yu Eitzim Yotzim Min HaMizbeach Klum, that tells you that eitzim are not allowed to go off of Mizbeach. And so therefore, basically you had a portion in the middle of Mizbeach called the Maracha, or where the Shnei Gzir Eitzim were placed, and they were 1 amma by 1 amma exactly. They did not go off the Mizbeach. They didn't go off the side. It's not in fact. So that is the end of the discussion about the Gzirei Eitzim. We're now up to the last, well, not the last, but the next topic for today, which is the third to last narrow line on Daf Samach Bet Amud Aleph. It's not Hatam. Now, this is a Mishnah in Masechet Midot, which many of us, of course, have learned Masechet Midot or forgotten Masechet Midot, but this is a Mishnah Midot, which says the following: Kevesh haya l'dromosha mizbeach. Right? You have a mizbeach. A mizbeach is a square. The ramp has to come off one side. Which side? So, obviously we don't know yet. Says the Mishnah, it comes off the south side. Now, we of course know that because we've learned this 100 times. But if you're facing, just to be clear, if you're coming in out of the gates and you're facing the Kodesh, right, you're facing west and you're coming from the east. So the left is your south and the right is your north. Okay? Got that? North, south, west, east, right? So if you're walking in, the Mizbeach is placed, let's just say, in the middle. It's not really. The ramp goes to the left, it goes to the south. So that's the Mishnah says that. It was on the south. Orech 32, it was 32 amot long. Al rochav 16, it was 16 amot wide. Remember, the Mizbeach was 32 by 32, square. So the ramp was as long as the Mizbeach, but it was half the distance, right? So it was narrower, and you've all seen pictures. Hopefully your Gemara has a picture of the ramp going up to the Mizbeach, not covering the whole space. That's the Mishnah. Says our Gemara today, Menani Mili. How does the Mishnah know that? Amar Rav Huna, Amar Kra says Rav Huna, because the pasuk says, "V'shachat oto," you shech this talking about a carbon, right? Carbon ola al yerach hamizbeach tzafona, on the thigh. No, so the yerach literally means the side, right? The arm basically, or the thigh. A yerach is a leg of the mizbeach on the north, right? So if the legs are in the north, that means that the face is in the south. If you think of the mizbeach as a body and you anthropomorphize it, and the legs are in the north, yarech b'tzafon, panav b'darom. The face, the body of the mizbeach, so to speak, is facing this way. To the right, I don't know if that's what you see, is the north, the left is the south, and the legs are here, and you go down to the south. Says the Gemara, that's not a very good proof. Ema, yarech b'tzafon, panav b'tzafon. I don't know. Some people you could sit up, your legs are in the south, are in the north, and your face is in the north. I mean, you don't have to be lying down. Amar Rava, well, Rami Gavra Api. What you have to think about the mizbeach as a person lying down. Right, a person lying down on their face, in which case they're stretched out, their legs are in the north, and their face is on the south. Amalei Abaya Adaraba Teritzvo Tiv Gavra. Say the guy is sitting up, right? You're sitting down. You could be sitting. Teritz means you explain it, where you're sitting up and you're facing forward, meaning you're when you face forward, you're sitting in a chair, your legs are in front of you and your head's in front of you, right? You're not lying down. So it's not a proof. Amalei said to him, well, Ravuachtiv. Right, the reason is because the Torah describes the mizbeach as being square, and square implies that you're not crouching, you're not going in the ball, you're laying flat. Even though Ravua doesn't mean flat in this case, right? But that's what it means. Hami baile demarba mervui. But the word Ravua is not there to tell you you're lying down. Mizbeach is lying down. It's telling you that the mizbeach needs to be square. So Ravua here doesn't mean lying down; it means square. Says more, well, michtiv miruba. Does it say miruba, right? Meaning if it had just said miruba, it would be telling you that it's square. The fact that it used the word ravua basically tells you two things. It tells you that basically it's laying down sorry, it's laying down, right? The ravua, and not that it's, which we compare, and this is the subtext of this whole Gemara, that the word ravua sounds a little bit like ravutz. Ravutz means laying down, right, or crouching. So that basically the word ravua sounds a lot like laying down. It doesn't say laying down. Tamech nichtiv ravutz. It doesn't say the word ravutz, which is what you're sort of interpreting ravua. Amar, well, you're right, it doesn't say ravutz, but it says ravua, which means chtiv. The mashmahachi umashmahachi. The word ravua to me means two things. It means square and it means laying down. And so I'm imagining the mizbeach as a body laying down. And since the pasuk describes the legs, the yerach hamizbeach tzafona, the legs being in the north, the head has to be, meaning the ramp has to be in the south. Okay, the face of it, the pnei. So that is the first answer. Okay, which of course is seems a little bit of a stretch. Tana mighty lemihach. Now the Tana brings a proof from a completely different source. The Tanya, what is the right to say? What is the right to say? Where am I up to? The right to we are the fifth wide line. Rabbi Yehuda quotes a pasuk, a very unusual pasuk in Yecheskel. Remember that in Sefer Yecheskel, the Navi goes through the drawings in his head, right? So the description of what the future Beit HaMikdash will, or what the Beit HaMikdash will look like, right? We understand it to mean the future Beit HaMikdash because it doesn't really fit with the current Beit HaMikdash. But Yecheskel was in the time when there was no Beit HaMikdash, right? He was having this nevuah during the Churban of the Bayit Rishon. So he described the future Beit HaMikdash, and in the description he says umaletehu, it's ma'aleh, it's ramp, right? It's incline, pinot kadim, will turn to the east. Okay, now of course, what does that tell you? That when you go up the ramp, you turn to the east. And says the Braita, Kol pinot shata poneh, when you turn, lo yehi el derech yamin, you're only allowed to turn to your right. And it says that when you turn, it goes to the east. So it must be lemizrach. It must be that you're going up the mizbech on the south, right? And again, the south comes up. In front of you is north, to the left is west, and to the right is east. So if you're going to go up the mizbeach on the ramp and turn up the ramp, to the mizbeach and turn right, which you have to, the Torah says in Yecheskel, when you turn right, it's going to be the east. So you clearly see that the ramp is on the south. It says Gemara, it doesn't say anything about turning right. It just says turn and you get to the east. Maybe Amos Smolda Mizrach. Maybe the Mizbech, the ramp is on the north, and you walk up the ramp on the north and you turn left to go east, right? How do you know you're turning right? Says Gemara, that's a different principle. Lo Sakadaitach, it can't be that you're turning left. The Tani Rami Bar Yecheskel, that Yaron Yecheskel taught from the following pasuk. It says about the Yam Sha'asa Shlomo, right? This is a pasuk in Divrei Yamim. Shlomo, remember, made this big yam. Yam means literally water. But he made a big basin that they could wash out of. And the pasuk describes it the following: Omeid al shnei masar bakar. It was standing on a base of 12 cattle, right? They were not real animals. It was carved out. The base was 12 cattle, 3 in each direction. Shlosha ponim tzafona. 3 were facing north. Shlosha panim yama. 3 were facing west. Shlosha panim negba. 3 were facing south. Shlosha panim mizracham. 3 were facing east. Now, if you do the math in your head and you go, imagine the top of your watch is north, you go west, south, and east, that is what we call counterclockwise, or turning to the right, right? So if you are at 6 o'clock on your clock, on your watch, which I'm calling south in this case, and you turn to 3 o'clock, right? That's counterclockwise, and that's turning to the right. So we learn from that pasuk in Divrei Yamim, shekol pinot shata poneh lo yehei el derech yamin lemizrach. Every time you turn, you're supposed to turn to the right. And when the Torah says that when in Yecheskel, that when you turn to the right on the Mizbech, you'll get to the east, it's telling you that the ramp was on the south. You'd walk up the south side and you turn right to get to the east. Ask Gemara, but how could you prove anything from the Yam Shasa Shlomo? How can you buy the Gufay? The Torah needs to tell you that you have to have 12 bakar, and one is here, 3 are here, and 3 are there. This is where you're right, but im came ponim lamali. He keeps using the verb ponim. 3 of them were facing. Facing sounds like you are turning, right? When you turn, your face turns. So it sounds like that you're making a siur, you're making a tour basically around the Mizbeach, and because it does it in that order, north, west, south, east, it tells you that you always go counterclockwise. And of course, we practice this, when you do Hoshanot, for example, you go up to the Aron, right? You go up to in the circle, you always walk counterclockwise, which is right, to the right, basically. So that is the way you're supposed to go. Sha'al Rabbi Shimon ben Yossi ben Lakunya at Rabbi Yossi. Now, Rabbi Shimon ben Yossi ben Lakunya asked Rabbi Yossi, Omer aya Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai used to say, where are we up to? This is around... I don't know, around halfway down the wide lines. My Gemara is the Shita Mekubetzet on the right. So if you have the design by Shita Mekubetzet and you go straight to the left, you'll get to our line. But the question that Rabbi Shimon ben Yossi ben Lakunya asked Rabbi Yossi was that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was quoted as saying, Avir yesh ben kevish lemizbeach, right? He asked basically, is there space between the ramp and the mizbeach, right? So the ramp is this big long thing. The Mizbeach is right at the end of it. Is the ramp touching the Mizbeach, or is there a little bit of space in between them? Amarlo, so he said, Rabbi Yossi said back to him, Vata yato merkein, right? You don't agree? I mean, you're expressing amazement at Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who said that there was airspace between the ramp and the Mizbeach, meaning that, you could fall in, right? So it's like the subway. You got to be careful. The edge of the ramp ended, and then maybe an inch or two later started the Mizbeach. So that's what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said. And Rabbi Shimon ben Yossi ben Lekunyo sort of said, "What? How could that be? Or why is that?" Amarlos Rabbi Yossi said, "Ata American. You don't agree with that? It has to be that way because it says halok kfar nemer. It says in the pasuk." Interesting pasuk. Vasita olatecha. You make your korban olah habasar v'hadam with the meat and the blood, which is a hekish, right? We're comparing the meat to the blood, telling you madam bezrika, right? You have to sprinkle the blood. You don't actually touch the blood with the olah, right? You're showering it on the mizbeach. Af basar bezrika. So too the meat has to be thrown onto the mizbeach, and basically, when is the meat thrown onto the mizbeach? So basically, what we understand is that you would go to the top of the kevesh, you go to the top of the ramp, and you would not, there would be a space there potentially. This is one understanding. We're going to go into this a little bit more, but that basically there was space there, and you would throw the sarashes, you would throw you would stand on top of the ramp, and you would throw the meat onto the fire, right? Even though, just to be clear, even though if there's a space, it doesn't mean you can't walk over that space, but it means that you could be standing on the ramp and throw the meat onto the fire. Okay. Af basar bezrika. Amar lo. So he said back to him, sorry, I got that message. So Rabbi Shimon ben Yossi ben Lekunya said back to him, it's different. Shani Omer Omeid B'tzad Maracha v'Zorek. I agree with you that just like you have to throw the blood, you have to throw the meat onto the fire. But it doesn't mean you have to stand 10 feet away and pitch it, right? It means you go onto the Mizbeach, you stand next to the fire, and you throw the meat onto the fire, right? So Rabbi Yossi said back to him, I don't understand, right? Amar lo kashu zorek. Explain to me. When you're throwing this onto the fire, the marachad dluko zorek, ula maracha shen dluko zorek. Are you throwing meat onto a fire that's burning? Right, not a fire that's burning, onto a wood. Maracha is like the wood pile, a wood pile that's burning, or are you throwing the meat onto a wood pile that's not burning, right? Meaning it's burning, obviously. The fire is not started. You don't put the meat on it and then start the fire. You've got a fire going on the Mizbeach that they will light in the morning. It was lit all day, right? Havi omer zorek. So clearly you're putting the meat onto a big bonfire. Obviously, you're not taking your meat and gently placing it down onto the fire, right? Because you'd burn yourself. So you obviously are throwing the meat onto the fire. You're throwing the meat onto the fire because you can't place it down gently. You have to throw it onto the burning fire, right? But the Torah doesn't need to tell you that. Everyone with a brain would know that if there's a big burning fire, I've got to throw the meat onto it. Why did the Torah compare the meat to the blood? It must be to tell you that, in fact, sometimes you have to throw the meat from the top of the ramp onto the fire. And that means that there's a separation between the ramp and the Mizbeach. Papa says, I don't really think that that's the good proof. You know how I would understand it? Kidam. I would understand the pasuk is saying that the Mizbeach, the basar, basar vadam, is that the basar has to be like the dam. Ma dam avir karka mafsiko. Just like with blood, right? When a person, a Kohen, sprinkles blood on the Mizbeach, between where the Kohen's standing and the Mizbeach, there's ground, right? Because you don't stand on the Mizbeach and sprinkle the blood. You're standing on the ground, there's 3 inches, 5 inches. So to the basar avir karka mafsiko. This is how we understand it. There always has to be airspace when you're throwing the meat. So basically a very, very crazy concept, which is that the Kohanim are supposed to throw the meat on the Mizbeach the same way they throw the blood on the Mizbeach from a distance. And furthermore, just like when they throw the blood, there's airspace between where they're standing and the Mizbeach. When they throw the meat, they can't be standing on top of the Mizbeach and throw the meat. They have to be standing on the ramp, and there has to be an open space between the ramp and the Mizbeach in order for them to throw the meat on the Mizbeach. And that's how you know that there was a very small distance, open space between the edge of the ramp, it might be a large space, the edge of the ramp and the Mizbeach. Amar Rav Yehuda, says Rav Yehuda, while we're talking about the ramp, right, where are we up to? 6 lines in the bottom. Shnei kvashim, kitanim yotzim min hakevesh. Right, there's one big ramp that goes up. Remember, it's 32 feet long, 32 amot long, 60 feet long, this ramp or so, right? 50 to 60 feet. But there are 2 smaller side ramps. And those are one that is at the bottom of the Mizbeach that goes to the Yesod, right, which is just off the ground. And the other goes to the middle. Remember, there was a ledge on the bottom of the Mizbeach called the Yesod. There's a ledge in the middle of the Mizbeach called a Sovev. So how do you get to those places? There has to be a connection from the ramp. So there were 2 minor ramps that came out of the major ramp. One, Shebehen Ponim L'Yisod U'L'Sovev. Those 2, one of them went to the Yisod and one went to the Sovev. Even though the Yisod was an Amma, right? You didn't expect the Kohanim to jump on top of it, right? So they would walk on top of it if they needed to. So one was on the Yisod and one was on the Sovev. Those ramps were disconnected from the Mizbeach by a hair's breadth, meaning they went right up to the edge, but they did not touch the Mizbeach. Mishum shenemar saviv. Because the Torah says saviv, and we're understanding saviv to mean you have to be able to go all around the Mizbeach, even theoretically, there can't be anything touching the Mizbeach all the way around it. So the ramps had to stop a hair's breadth away from the Mizbeach at least. Rabbi Avo says, because Ravua, because it says Ravua, it says square, right? And so obviously if you have something that's square and you add an appendage to it, it's not square anymore. So the ramps can't be touching the Mizbeach because the Mizbeach has to be square. Says the Gemara, and we have to tell you both, that it has to have an area all the way around it that's clear and it's square. Because the Torah just said there has to be an open area all the way around it. I might have thought, okay, but it could be a circle, right? It doesn't have to be square. It just has to be an open space. But why can't you have a Mizbeach that's a circle and everyone would be very happy, right? So the Katav Rachmana Ravua, therefore the Torah said square. Now, Katav Rachmana Ravua, if you recall, Ravua does not always mean a square. It means a rectangle, right? Ravua means it's 4 sides, basically. Havamina ta'arich v'katin. I might have thought it can be long and narrow, meaning it could be a rectangle where it's 20 amot long and 10 amot wide. So it's not proportional. Katav Rachmana Saviv. Therefore, the Torah said Saviv to tell you that the outside is to all be the same, and that basically the Mizbeach has to be exactly square, and there can be nothing touching the Mizbeach, which means that the ramps have to be with a tiny little space between the ramp and the Mizbeach. Let's just go to the Mishnah. Now we have one more Mishnah in Midot for today, which is Hakevesh Mizbeach Shishim Mishtayim. The length from the edge of the ramp to the edge of the Mizbeach was 62 amot. Now remember, the math doesn't add up because the Mizbeach was 32, the ramp was 32. So that would mean it should be 64. Asking Mara, Hanishitin V'arbahavi, it's 64. Nimsa Pareach Amal Yesod V'Amal Sovev. The reason is that the ramp would fly, Pareach means it fly, it was above the Yesod and above the Sovev. Because when you remember, the Mizbeach being 32 by 32 was measuring from the floor, where there's a Yesod. When you go in 1 amma on each side, above the Yesod, it's 30 by 30. When you go in 1 more amma on each side, it's 28 by 28, right? So basically, now on the side of that's the Sovev. On the side of the ramp, it went in 1 amma at the Yesod, 1 amma at the Sovev, and the ramp basically covered over those. So the ramp was 32. The Mizbeach from the edge of the ramp was only 30 because there was 1 missing from the Yesod and 1 missing from the Sovev. So 32 and 30 is 62. Amar Rabbi Rami Rachama says, Rami Rachama, if you want to be an architect and you want to understand the proportions of ramps, the hypotenuse, I guess, of a height to a length of a ramp, called kivshe kivashim. Whenever you make a small ramp, right? Or most ramps, I would say, regular ramps, shalosh amot la'ama. The proportion that they teach you is, if you're making a wheelchair access, you should go up 3 amot for each. You should have 3 amot of length for 1 amma of height, right? So that's a gradual incline. I don't know what it exactly equals, what angle that is, but it's a gradual incline. So to go up 1 amma, you should have 3 ammas of length. Remember, in the Beit HaMikdash, they didn't have that because the Beit HaMikdash, remember, they went up 9 amot from the floor. And the kevish was 32. 32 divided by 9 is not 1/3, or the opposite, right? 3 divided by 1 is 3. 32 divided by 9 is 3.3 or something, right? So, chutz mikivsho shel mizbeach, shaya shalosh amot umechza, it was 3.5 amot. The etzba ushlish etzba bezachuta. It was 3 amot, and this is the measurement. 3 amot per, meaning for each amma of height, the length was more than 3 amot. So normally you only need 3 amot. For 9 amot of height, you would need 27 amot. But the mizbeach was 30. The kevesh on the mizbeach was 32 because it was 3 amot and a half, right? Mechza, sorry. And which is a little bit close, and an etzba, 1 finger's worth, vishlish etzba, and a third of a finger, bizachuta. Zachuta means you measure by the tip of the thumb, and that's a certain way that you would measure amot. So basically, it was 3.5 plus a little bit more. And the reason for that, as Rashi explains, is that when the Kohanim were walking up the ramp, they were carrying very heavy loads, right? And so because of that, you needed the incline to be less steep. So for each amma that you went up, instead of having 3 amot of length, you had 3.5, so that it was a little bit easier incline to do the exercise, to walk up the ramp in order to bring the heavy korbanot up to the Mizbeach. We are up to the Mishnah on Samach Gimel, and God willing, we will pick it up in person on Sunday morning. Shavua Tov.